The next thing in our journey into Tonglen and mind training is to go into the four thoughts that turn the mind. And these are, sometimes they're talked of as foundations, but that almost, it's absolutely true, they're foundational contemplations, but they're also something that creates a flavor in our practice that pervades everything in our practice. So, foundation is good. Basic is good because it is the basis. It's an elementary piece to understand. Core is good because it forms the core of our practice as we go along. And generally, we look into the four thoughts that turn to mind as a means to check into just what is our situation, just in order to gain an accurate appreciation for what our circumstances really are, so that we can make a clearer decision, have deeper motivation about what we're going to do, how we're going to approach our life, how we will engage in our practice. And from this perspective, we very often find ourselves being encouraged to contemplate the four thoughts before we engage in a practice, just to become more clear in our minds and more deeply motivated. It's also worth noting that while this way of contemplation can sound like something that we do just preliminary to something else, that the four thoughts are so profound that they can be engaged in ways that are very particular to the practice, whatever practice it is. In talking with Lama Michael once, we came to the agreement that even though you could say these are preliminary practices or foundational practices, each one of them could be what we call in our tradition a pointing out instruction. If we really went very deeply into the contemplation, in each one we could find a pointing out instruction that would lead us to directly recognizing the nature of our own mind. So it's good to just keep that framework in mind. And this is in keeping with what Zopa has encouraged us to do, and she's encouraged us to think of this not as a beginner's practice, but one that has this very deep possibility, a very deep range. And I'm going to present the four thoughts, which include the contemplation of the precious human existence, contemplation of impermanence, the contemplation of karma, and the contemplation of suffering, or the faults of samsara. I'll present these first in a very general way so that we can understand the ideas, and you can see in that how it forms a basis for generating motivation. Then I'll give some examples of how we could go deeper into at least two of the contemplations as a basis for Tonglen, how it relates more directly. It's very connected. If we want to truly take advantage of our lives, it's important to appreciate the circumstances that we have and to have an accurate picture of that. So one of the first things to look into is just how rare the opportunity that we have. It really is. If we look in the world and we understand all the turmoil, the ups and downs, and the way it appears that so many beings are really, you could say, trapped, very much trapped by circumstances, both external and internal. If we look and we contemplate how it is that we have the opportunities that we do in this life, we may take advantage of those opportunities, really become to see clearly what those opportunities really offer us. As Zopa mentioned, even in this country to have, be able to take a Friday morning off, not so common. In this world, to have even a building that's semi-heated, to have freedom from turmoil immediately surrounding us, to be free in this moment from people who are pursuing us. All these things, and it's good to take a moment to look into all the dimensions of this in your own life and to look with some detail. So this is a very long-term contemplation. And it can be very down to earth, connect us very much to our immediate circumstances. And if we really look closely at those circumstances, it can be shocking how rare this opportunity is and how many causes and conditions need to come together for us to be even just sitting here this morning. So we can take a few moments here to actually engage in this. And it's helpful to go through both the obvious things that come to mind. I have a reasonably healthy body. I have the time off. I have the capacity to generally understand things. There are lots of just basic things to look at. I've come in contact with teachings that can offer something truly profound. I have an appreciation for the potential of that. So it's good to take a moment to look at this part of the precious human existence. So we'll take a minute or two to do that. the more we look into the opportunities and the rarity of those opportunities in our life, the more we can appreciate what's possible, the more we can come to value these opportunities and be clear about what these opportunities are. Be clear about how to take advantage, that we should take advantage of all the things that have come our way, and take advantage of them in the most skillful possible way. Because they depend on so many causes and conditions, which leads directly to the second contemplation, the contemplation of impermanence. All the causes and conditions that have come together to present us with the opportunities that we have. They're fragile, they're unstable, things come and go. In this world, at present, it's easy to appreciate impermanence on a larger scale because we're more connected. We have a deeper understanding of the natural world and the large swings in conditions. Even in our lives, where previously we might have a career that lasted an entire life, even the existence of that field of endeavor might come and go in not so many years. And one of the most fundamental conditions that we rely on is this human life. This human life, which is finite in span and uncertain in length. So it's important, if we are to take advantage of our situation and have an accurate understanding of our circumstances, to take this into account. To take into account the possibility that our life could be brought short. But even if not brought short, the certainty that this span of life will come to an end. And given the almost miraculous display of causes and conditions that have allowed us the opportunity that we have now, in the future, there's no guarantee. Even within this life, there's no guarantee that our capacities will remain sufficient for us to take advantage of this life. So it's important to reflect and be clear, and to see whether or not we're facing this with a clear mind, or whether we're, to the extent to which we're lost in the momentum of whatever is going on now, so that we don't really take into account the very finite quality of this life. So take a few moments to reflect on both how it is that you lose track of the finite quality of this life and the certainty of death. How we lose track of the certainty that conditions will change. And think for a moment about how it would be if an appreciation of this fact of life were really more at the forefront. So take a moment to reflect on this. looking into impermanence, it is easy to foresee that there will be times when all the causes and conditions that afford us opportunities will fall apart in one way or another. Especially at the time of death, as we're dying, as we're experiencing the rapidly diminishing capacity of our being as we approach death. When this arises, when these changes in conditions arise, when death approaches, we will not have the opportunity to do everything that we think we should have done. We will be riding on whatever momentum it is that we've created. Whether it's positive, helpful acts, deeper insight, more stable mind that we've had an opportunity to cultivate, or whether it is turmoil, because we've been depending upon just getting by because conditions were pretty good, and now we don't know what to do. And so it's important to consider also the truth of karma. What is it that we should do? What is it that we should abandon? And to really deeply appreciate this, it's necessary to look and see the impact of all that we do on how our life unfolds. The impact of all that we do on our friends, family, all other beings. We generally act based on habitual patterns, some of which are helpful, many of which are not. And in order to take advantage of our opportunities, we have to be clear-minded about making choices. We have to appreciate those kinds of imprints that we can leave in our mind that will lead us away from harmful actions, that will lead us away from confusion, that will lead us away from the habitual tendency to see things in very small ways in terms of things that will make us happy for the moment, particularly things that might be done at the expense of others. So it's important to appreciate the extent to which we have degrees of freedom in this life to make choices. We have degrees of freedom that are actually offered to us by the choices of what we've done with body, speech, and mind in the past. So it's important to reflect frequently on this principle, the principle that what we do, what we say, what we think, plants the seeds for the future. And that we should be careful about what it is that we do. So take a few moments to reflect on both the positive results of your past actions, the past actions of others that have contributed to the possibilities and great opportunities that you have now. Think about that, and think also about that which you would aspire to do and commit yourself to do in this life, to make sure that you leave the imprints in your mind stream that will allow for positive things to unfold in the future, both for yourself and for others. So reflect for a moment on cause and effect. reflecting on cause and effect, particularly reflecting on the impact of what we do with our minds, the imprint that that leaves in our being, and how that colors our experience. Reflecting on this, it's possible to appreciate more deeply the potential for both increasing confusion and suffering, and also the potential for decreasing it. And we can also begin to witness, as we look more and more carefully at how we create these karmic imprints moment to moment, looking more carefully at our own actions and thoughts, speech. We can appreciate both the ways in which it results in obvious confusion and suffering, and the ways it can diminish that. But when we look around, it's easy to see that the circumstances that we find ourselves in contain a lot of confusion and suffering. And it's important to look deeply into this. In a way, we have to go back and forth between the contemplation of karma and the examination of our stream of experience. To look at that and then look at the results. To look at what flows out of our actions. To appreciate how it is that we might take advantage of whatever circumstances that we're in to develop wisdom and compassion, to develop the causes, cultivate the causes for decreased suffering for ourselves and others. In this, it's important to actually look directly into what on earth is this suffering? What is this satisfaction that I experience? What is this? How does it actually arise in my mind, in my experience? We usually shrink away from anything unpleasant. So on the surface, it seems challenging to want to even look into the matter. But if we have some tools that we can use to begin to transform our relationship with our experience, then again, in order to have an accurate understanding, an accurate picture of the circumstances that we're in, we have to look deeply into confusion and suffering. For many years, I only gave, at best, lip service to the notion that suffering was pervasive. Because in my life, there were so many moments of comfort. There were so many moments of happiness. And I felt like I was being asked to call those moments of comfort discomfort. And I felt like, oh my, I'm going to lose the little bit that I have. Why would I do this? And so it took many years to actually appreciate the potential to look deeply into this. Seeing that I was not able to control how experiences came to me through impermanence, through meeting the ripening of my past karma, confusion and suffering arises. So how do I relate to this? How do I look deeply into this? And at one level, there's an appreciation that what we call just the ordinary suffering, the suffering of suffering, is quite common. For us, perhaps, given remarkable good fortune of our circumstances, it's less than it is many other places. Most of us do not have to be concerned about where lunch will come from. But this is a pervasive concern, both with people and also with animals as well. And it's like that with all the things that we consider comfortable. We also have to blend this with our contemplation of the precious human existence and impermanence, to really look carefully and say, even though I know where lunch is coming from today, in the future that's not certain. How do I look deeply into my being to skillfully relate to all these circumstances that are arising? Or could arise. So appreciating the difficulties of the suffering of suffering, most of us will have some direct experience of this. But even if our lives proceeded in the most blessed way, where we were never beset by depression, conflict, at the time of death, the body ceases to cooperate and produce comforting feelings. So how then will we relate to our experience? Will we have the tools to look into discomfort and suffering? And we can go deeper and deeper into this topic, this contemplation, looking at the way that we grasp after circumstances as permanent, and even within the grasping, there is a disquiet, a concern about circumstances not being stable. And we can go deeper and deeper into it, and we will perhaps in the future. But for the moment, just consider how pervasive just the suffering of suffering is in this world, not only amongst humans, but also amongst animals who have to be concerned about being eaten. Not just where lunch will come from, but whether or not they will be lunch. And also look at the propensity to hold on to circumstances as stable, even when there's evidence that they're not stable. So look at this. Looking deeply into this, the picture of how causes and conditions come together and all the, you could say, the churn of suffering and confusion in the world. It would be wise to avoid thinking about this if there was simply nothing to be done. But fortunately, there is something to be done. We can turn our attention from reliance on the futile wish that everything will turn out to our advantage and circumstances can be depended upon for our well-being. We can turn to something deeper.
Thank you, Bill. Let's just take a couple minutes in place. Stand up if you need to. Just a little stretch. Then we're going to go about 10 more minutes and have a big break. So just where you are, a little stretch. Sip of tea. A momentary relief of perhaps some suffering, but it won't last. And it won't be complete. So as we contemplate these four thoughts, which are in the book of Tonglen that you'll take home, as Bill just led us into, I like what he said. I want to repeat it in my own words. It would not be a good idea to contemplate all this suffering if one thought there's nothing to do about it. And I think that I look at my own mind and it has that in it, like, don't look at it. There's nothing to do. Just grab for the next comfort, the next nice meal, the next movie, the next dinner out with friends, the next play, the next novel, the next relationship, the new house, the new car, the vacation. This is what we do. Those are all fine, but we mistake their nature, as Bill has been pointing at. We think there's something in there that is not in there. So when we get the Buddhist point of view, or what the Buddha taught about life, this deep, deep understanding of suffering has to come before we can get free of it. So how do we face that? Oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. So we can't do this alone, and in fact, we don't do anything alone. We can remember that. But we can particularly turn to what we call sources of refuge, reliable sources of refuge. So the metaphor is we're in a vast ocean of suffering. Sometimes the wave's not so big. We can fool ourselves. I'm okay today. I don't need to think about it. But the clouds gather on the horizon and the big storm comes. Maybe it's the death of someone who you love and you're close to. Maybe it's the fires in California. Maybe it's people leading the world that you don't trust and you are fearful of. Maybe it's a diagnosis you suddenly get that is frightening. We all know all these things. We could list on and on. So we seek refuge from the storm, and also refuge from the times we fool ourselves when the storm's not occurring. We fool ourselves into thinking, there won't be a storm ever again. I made it through that one. Yeah. So storms come, but the point is, how do we meet them? And this is one of the keys in the refuge and bodhicitta. So generally, what we've been pointing at here, what the teachings are pointing at, we take refuge in things that are not reliable. So when we come to this path, we start finding, if we're paying attention, reliable sources of refuge. The first one that appears that can be sometimes kind of grasped, not in a clinging way, but understood, is the teacher as a model. Oh, I remember the first time I met my root teacher, Venerable Thubten Chodron, something very strange happened. Just very strange. But I started watching her and going to her retreats and watching her. And at some point, what I realized is, and people get this from the Dalai Lama or the Karmapa or Khenpo Lodro Donyo or Bokar Rinpoche, whatever, who they call great beings that you meet. This human is doing something kind of different than most of the humans I've seen. There's some kind of aura or presence around them. And then that one can become a reliable source of refuge, as my teacher has been for me for 24 years. Exceedingly reliable for 24 years. Amazing. So why? Why are they reliable? Because they're following the Buddha. They're following the Buddha's teachers. They're looking deeply at the suffering, their own and others. They're living a human life, but in a way that completely follows a different set of actions, methods, thoughts, philosophy, psychology, whatever you want to call it. They're following something that's different than what I had followed before, and maybe you know that already. Some of you have practiced for many years here. So we say that we contemplate all these things that Bill so skillfully led us through, this suffering, the impermanence, which is our death, like the monastics I lived with for 5 years, they wear this shirt that they put on every morning, and it has these little points that go over their, it's a collar, but it's points, and it's front and back, and it's a reminder that you're in the jaws of death all day. It's quite wonderful. I mean, even their clothing, every piece of it is a teaching. So you put on your little danka, it's called, and it's like points front and back, and death has you in its jaws. You just remind yourself of that every morning, and perhaps when you look in a mirror and see your danka, it's like, oh, everybody I'm looking at's gonna die, so maybe I don't want to be mean to them. Maybe I don't want to criticize them. Maybe I want to be kind. So we take refuge in the Buddha, in the people that follow the Buddha so closely. We take refuge in all the teachings, the Dharma, all the teachings. They say 84,000. I don't know if there's really 84,000, but I like to think of that, because then everybody could find something they could get a hold of, right, to move forward. And it'll be different for different ones of us. You'll see something that you can get your toehold on and go forward with it. And it won't be the same one as even your teacher sometimes. So we take refuge in Buddha and Dharma, and we take refuge in the Sangha. So we say the exalted Sangha, or the Arya Sangha. That's the beings who understand reality as it is, who see that these appearances are illusory, but still appear. And it's still important for us to act within that dreamlike appearance world with ethics, with kindness, with love, with compassion. But on an ultimate level, even like but not totally same, I will say, even similar to Western science, which is showing the harder you look, the less there is there. So now they have to run two very tiny particles at each other to find the ultimate particle. But Buddha already did that in his own mind, and 2,600 years ago said, you're not going to find it. But it still functions. Interesting, huh? So we take refuge in these truths. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, we take refuge in our teachers as manifestations of Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Because if you're in these waves, which we are, and you have this precious little raft of Dharma, of Sangha, this is Sangha too. The people who want to study and practice what you want. We have these precious conditions, a temporarily healthy body, temporarily brain good enough to follow, temporary health, temporary life. That's the little raft in the big ocean. So we take refuge in it, we take care of it, we keep our little boat fixed and good, and we invite other people on it. So this becomes the bodhicitta, the fully awakened mind that sees everything's an illusion, yet everything functions. And therefore, I want to practice my ethics, my loving kindness. I want to keep death right there. Oh yeah, any could be today. If my death was coming today, what would I do differently? Because one of us can be taken out in a car accident. One of us can get the diagnosis today of a terminal disease. So easy for those things to happen. So this bodhicitta, awakened mind, sees all that, and within it sees no difference between you and me. No separation, really. Not really. So when I begin to love you, I'm loving me. Even this kind of non-difference, if you look at me here, I call this me, you call it her. Different names, doesn't matter. It's all just flowing, right? Just labels, all kinds of that. So this is how we take refuge. So let's look on page, I think there's a refuge prayer in here. Yes, let's look on page 12. This very short prayer, where it says recite, contains both refuge and bodhicitta. The bodhicitta is just in the last line. May I awaken fully in order to help all beings. That's the bodhicitta. The rest is your refuge. I take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the Supreme Assembly. In the middle there are the practices that we're going to talk about after lunch. Through the goodness of generosity and the other virtues, may I awaken fully in order to help all beings. That fully awaken.
Maybe a different line in different books.
Oh, we've got two different translations of this. I'm reading from an old one. Okay, so we take refuge, still on page 12 though, and through our practice of generosity, patience, and the other perfections, which we're going to not go through so much, we're going to do the immeasurables instead, but we can review those tomorrow, or there'll be Q&A. May I wake for the sake of all beings. So that's why we do this. There's no way, actually, I don't think, to kind of save yourself alone. Who would that be? There is no self alone. Self all alone. Who brought you food? Who got you here? Who made your car? Who built the roads? Who gave you the cushion? When are we alone? I didn't make this sweater, but I like it a lot. I got it at Goodwill. It's boiled wool. You can't find boiled wool anymore. Sorry, I'm going off on something. But anyway, it keeps you very warm. So let's do this prayer together and then let's have lunch. Until full enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly of the Sangha. Through the practice of generosity, patience, and the other perfections, may I awake for the sake of all beings. 3 times. Until full enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly of the Sangha. Through the practice of generosity, patience, and the other perfections, may I awake for the sake of all beings. Until full enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly of the Sangha. Through the practice of generosity, patience, and the other perfections, may I awake for the sake of all beings. And if you have a different verse there, that's fine too. Okay, we are going to break for lunch. It's closer to, oh wait, no, we're not breaking for lunch. Zopa just wants to have lunch now. So she's jumping ahead. Oh, I love that. Okay, dear, you gotta wait. There are snacks. So let's take 10 minutes and come back, and then I will review the 4 immeasurables, which are part of the way out of this conundrum. Okay.